Okie dokie. So now let's mobilize for war. This is the most entertaining part of the war, in that what America is doing. So we've seen the political point, all the reasons why we went to war, what Wilson wanted to do, how Wilson wanted to make the world different, right? So this is sort of Wilsonian idealism. Now let's talk about what America did to get ready for the war. How did America mobilize? And one thing America had to do is to convince Americans that we needed to fight this war. And George Creel was tapped to head the Committee of Public Information. And we're going to, it's called the Creel Committee, was another word for it, another term for it. And we're going to see plenty of propaganda and posters the Creel Committee puts out. But essentially what their job is, and he was a journalist, it was trying to convince Americans not only to engage themselves in the war effort, whether you're older buying Liberty bonds, or disliking the Germans, or signing up for the service. It's trying to convince Americans of the need for and the glory of this war. Over 150,000 workers participated, 75,000 of which were called 4 Minutemen, and they would go all over these places, these 4 Minutemen of the Creel Committee, and they would get up on soapboxes and get up on little ladders, and they would talk about how you need to join in the war effort. And they would point at people. What are you doing for the war effort? Are you doing enough for the war effort? Are you going to stand there and let other people sacrifice for you while you do so little? Will you at least voluntarily sacrifice maybe some of your food intake for the soldiers? Will you sacrifice, gas heating to give it to the soldiers? What will you sacrifice for the soldiers? And most of this sacrificing was not government mandated. Was in World War II a lot more. In World War I, it was more voluntary. Wilson never felt comfortable making the central government so overwhelmingly powerful that it could make people give up their food, or give up their heating energy, or give up stuff. It was more based on volunteerism. Now, World War II, which the situation is more dire, it became a little bit less about volunteerism. But I will say, the central government did become much larger during World War I and much more powerful during World War I, but nothing to the extent of World War II. So one problem with this, though, is that in trying to sell Americans and the rest of the world on America getting involved, they oversold it. And then once America was involved, the expectation level for what America and Wilson could do to make the world better when the war was over, it was too much. And then when Wilson couldn't deliver, there was a shattering of dreams. So they actually oversold the idea of American entrance. So let's talk about civil liberties, because civil liberties were kind of trampled on in the face, and the argument was where it's during war. Okay, so there were all these, there was a lot of anti-German hysteria. Right? We can't trust Germans. We're fighting these Germans and you can't trust them. And America, a ton of America is German. And so Americans started turning a very suspicious eye to their German neighbor. You can't blame them. Look at Rahel and Hurt, by God. They look suspicious. And it became so ridiculous. Some German Americans were tarred and feathered. Many were beaten. In fact, there was one German American who was drugged from his house, lynched, hung by a bridge, castrated, before they hung him from the bridge. Although that would have been an engineering feat. And then used as target practice. And when that case was brought to court, it was ruled a suicide. Beethoven, people stopped playing it. People stopped playing Wagner. Schools stopped teaching German. Colleges stopped teaching German. Street names all over America were changed. Food names were changed. Instead of, today, We don't call them Frankfurters, we call them hot dogs. We call them hot dogs because people changed it during World War I. There are plenty of names. German families started changing their names. Instead of being von Braun, they'd just be Brown because they didn't want to sound German. It was radically suspicious. And although there was no real evidence to suggest that Germans were plotting against America, in fact, most, or almost, we'll say all, but universally, Germans were extremely loyal. German Americans were loyal to America. But they did pass two laws, Congress did. One was the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act, you could be put in prison for making false statements about the government or aiding the enemy, and that can mean anything, including speaking out against the draft. You could be arrested. And many people were arrested for violating this and speaking out against the draft or holding anti-war statements. But even more far-reaching was the Sedition Act. Now, we talked about a Sedition Act in 1798. You'll remember the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions written by Jefferson and Madison went against the Alien and Sedition laws, which would have cut into free speech rights. This Sedition Act is similar, but went even further, and part of it's because of the anti-war hysteria. You couldn't criticize the government. You couldn't do anything with a flag. You couldn't criticize people in uniform. You couldn't say anything bad about the government. Over 1,900 people were prosecuted. In fact, many famous people, such as Eugene Debs, went to jail. In fact, Debs was in jail for a couple of years for violation of the Sedition Act. Big Bill Haywood, who was the head of the IWW, the Radical Labor Union, the Wobblies, right? The International Workers of the World, he was sentenced. And so these court cases actually got challenged in court. And if I'm going too fast, you can have whomever stop and start, that's fine. But this was challenged in court. And a really famous court case that many of you talked about last year with me in government economics, Schneck versus U.S. In Schneck versus U.S., Schneck was an anti-war crusader who was passing out propaganda against the draft. And he was arrested, and it made its way to the Supreme Court. This is in 1990. In fact, this happened after the war was over. But this case upheld the government's right to suppress his speech. Ironically, this court case has been used for decades by free speech advocates and free press advocates. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who you might remember from when we were looking at the mandatory where those prisoners couldn't have kids, they were going to not castrate them, but words come up twice in 10 minutes. Whatever you do to those people, he was the one who said surely 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. He actually wrote this, and he said, you can limit free speech when it presents a clear and present danger to evils that Congress has the right to prevent. And you don't have to write all that in your notes, just to know that Congress has the right to limit free speech when it presents a clear and present danger to some sort of violent affair. But what he wrote was that free speech and free press is there, specifically free speech, not to say whatever you want, whenever you want to say it, but it's there to protect people who have minority opinions. That because your opinions are unpopular politically, you cannot be silenced. But you can't just say whatever you want that could possibly incite violence. But you do have the right to stand up for your beliefs, even if they're in the minority, or even if everybody hates them. So that was Schneck versus U.S. So that is getting the country mobilized in terms of propaganda, that is civil liberty issues. Now let's talk about industry and how we're going to be producing for this war and how we're going to be mobilizing our factories. We were not overwhelmingly prepared for this war when it happened, industrially. And a guy named Bernard Baruch, Bernard spelled normally, Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H, UCH. He was appointed to something called the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board was a government organization who attempted to organize industries in such a way to help with the war agenda, right? So we need steel industries to give the government, allow the government to buy steel from them for war purposes. We need big business to chip in. Now the government would pay them, obviously. In fact, the government paid them pretty well. But they wanted the government to, the War Industries Board was a government trying to organize industry. And organizing industry was tough. People believed in laissez-faire economics. This didn't work as well, but it was moving America towards understanding that a powerful central government could organize economic output if it wanted to. So Baruch used mostly voluntarily asking industries to allow the government to be a main purchaser of their goods. For a long time, this doesn't work as well. Eventually, he got power to make companies do that. Eventually, he made companies, but this was a very short time. For the most part, again, it was about volunteerism. Now, during World War II, FDR is not going to give them any chance. He says, "You're going to do whatever we say." For World War I, it was more about volunteerism, and just near the end was about sort of forcing government or companies to do this. But companies did not want to. In fact, as soon as the war was over, this thing just went away real fast. But the War Industries Board is important because it's the first step in a centralized government trying to organize industry for the war effort. Originally volunteerism, but eventually more enforcement, but just for a little bit. When it comes to labor, they also need workers to chip in. You don't just have to be soldiers, we need workers to chip in. And America's minority populations will start to move forward because of this. Women are a perfect example. In fact, women were able to move socially ahead very quickly during the war. Many women began to work a lot because inflation was hitting pretty hard, and they needed women. Many families needed women to work to bring in more income. Also, many men were fighting, and so women came into the factories to work for the men who were overseas. Many women worked, they were called farmerettes. When men would go off to fight, women would run the farms. A lot of women actually participated, and they actually were in the military service. In fact, 269 of them were Marines. Lots in the Army. African Americans became important, specifically with the migration. And actually, I have a map of that. Now, this map is more about what's happening after World War II, rather. You can see this is more in the 1940s and 50s. But during World War I, like 1917, 1918, and just after 1919, 1920, you started seeing a lot of African Americans leaving the segregated, sharecropping South, going to industrialized cities where they were making war goods. Right? There were decent factory jobs here where they could find a much better standard of living. And even whole communities were moving up to Newark and Harlem, D.C., Philly, Chicago, Detroit. Whole families and whole little areas were moving up to try to find better work. And this is going to start the beginning of a migratory pattern of African Americans that will last for a long time. Today, we think of African Americans as a largely urban population, but that wasn't the case up until World War I. And obviously during World War II, people will start moving out west too. During World War I, it's all just on the Atlantic side. We're not fighting Japan. But we're going to see a similar pattern during World War I of African American migration.